And they looked really at just two types of data. They looked at bird observations from surveys and bird counts for over 4 decades. And they looked at climate data, fairly simple climate data at that time, temperature and precipitation over the 4 seasons of the year. And they studied 588 species. The study took 7 years. And then they created a mathematical relationship or model that between where a bird occurs and its climate, so that they could really identify the climate that that bird requires in order to survive and to thrive. And then the study mapped not only the bird's current range, but using some projected climate scenarios, looked at whether that range might expand or stay the same or shift or contract. So that was in 2014. So every bird really has this set of environmental conditions, and they have evolved over a very long period of time. And the birds are adapted to a specific set of climate variables that allows them to really replace themselves and to thrive. So if it's too hot, if it's too cold, if it's too wet, or it's too dry, they simply may not be able to reproduce and replace their babies. So of that 588 species in that initial study, 314 were identified as threatened. 188 of those were projected to lose 50% of their climate suitable habitat by 2080. And the remaining 126 were projected to lose 50% of their climate suitable habitat by 2050, which is really not that far away. So in a little less than a year ago, in October of 2019, Audubon came back with an updated report entitled Survival by Degrees. It looked at a few more birds. It was a much more robust study, and I'll talk about the differences. It looked at 604 species and concluded that 389 of those are actually at risk of extinction if we don't begin to take action to reduce global warming. So that is almost 2/3, not quite 2/3, that would be at risk of extinction if climate or global warming reaches 3 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. I'm showing you some pictures of some skins of passenger pigeons. This bird is now extinct. There used to be billions of them in this country, but over the last 4 centuries, 9 species of birds in North America have gone extinct. And while 9 species is too many for me, it's not a huge number, especially in light of what is predicted by this study. So as I mentioned, there's a significantly more robust study than previously. It used advanced modeling techniques. It incorporated vegetation and human land use that was not available in the first study. It looked at additional scenarios on climate and many more climate variables, and looked at surface water changes that are predicted. So a significant amount of changes in that study. It also looked at many more data sets, 70 or so, and about 140 million observations, so significantly more data on the birds themselves. These are just 5 examples of that, of the data sets, but no one has assembled a larger data set of observations on North American birds. It also looked at warming scenarios for future projections, and these came from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they really considered 3 different scenarios, one being 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, the other 2 degrees centigrade, and the other 3 degrees centigrade. So currently we're at about 1 degree centigrade above pre-industrial levels. And most scientists agree that 1.5 degrees centigrade warming is imminent if we're not already there, and probably the best we can hope for. So we're at a critical time if we're going to keep that warming from reaching those 2 degree or 3 degree figures that are going to be especially critical for birds. I'm only going to show you 2 graphs. This one is global mean surface temperature, and you can see that It rises over time since 1880 when they first had decent records. It's clearly going up, and the last 5 years are the warmest years on record on the globe. Sometimes my advance button doesn't work. There we go. So why are rising temperatures such a threat to birds? Well, essentially, it alters the distribution of plants and the insects that those birds need in order to raise their babies. So a lot of people will ask me and say, Tom, well, birds can fly. Why don't they just fly north or inland or up to a place with a better climate? Well, there's certainly some logic in that, and there's there is some evidence that birds are moving a little bit, but the habitat does not move, or at least not quickly. So the habitat that they're used to, say in the grasslands in the center of the state, it's not going to move north as the climate change for maybe 100 years or so. The birds that breed at our high elevations here in western North Carolina, and Mount Mitchell is the highest point east of the Mississippi River. So that winter wren and that golden-crowned kinglet and the red-breasted nuthatch, there's no more up. They can't go any higher up. Certainly there is some evidence that birds are moving a little bit north, but the reality is that climate change works on the individual bird. So that bird is basically going to be faithful to where it was born. So our migrant birds, those warblers and other birds that go south to Central and South America, they're going to return to where they were born. And our local birds are going to stay where they were born. So they don't have temperature gauges, and they don't read the newspaper, so they don't really know things have changed. But what happens is that those plants are simply not producing as much food. There are not as many insects, and scientists will say that a pair of birds with young need to produce 1.7 fledglings from each nest in order to keep their population stable. If it drops to just 1.3, that population could crash. Wood thrush, for example, has lost 50% of its population over the last 4 decades. Not all of that is attributable to climate change, but climate change is really complicating it even more. So the last graph I'm going to show you, and perhaps the most compelling evidence of climate change or global warming, scientists are able to calculate CO2 concentrations by drilling cores into the ice. And as we know, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere really determines how hot our planet gets. CO2 and methane and other gases are called greenhouse gases because they trap the heat in the planet, and that's why it warms. So the more we burn, the hotter it gets. But looking at this record, and this goes back 800,000 years, so almost a million years, and it goes through both ice ages and warming periods during that time. And over that 800,000 years, the previous highest concentration of CO2 was 300 parts per million. And that was a little over 300,000 years ago. Today, or in 2018, we were at 407. I believe I've read that we were up to 408 or 409 now. So this is not normal. People will say that we're just going through fluctuations and the climate changes, and they're right, the climate does change, and as you can see, there are lots of fluctuations, but CO2 concentrations of 407 parts per million is not the normal. And we are certainly experiencing extreme weather events. It seems like every day we read something or see something online about an extreme weather event, whether it be a superstorm or a intense fire, flooding. We're all reading about the Arctic ice caps and the Antarctic ice caps beginning to melt. So this report, as I mentioned, being more robust, added a whole new level in looking at assessing climate-related threats. And they looked at, the scientists looked at about 9 different threats, One was change in water levels, whether that be sea level rise or the Great Lakes level rise. They looked at a couple of human impacted changes. I have to take a little sip of water right here, excuse me. Looked at urbanization. Certainly there's, our population is growing and development is growing. Looks like it looked at cropland expansion as we take away natural habitat in order to grow more crops. And then it looked at various extreme weather events, including spring heat and spring drought. Looks at fire and the weather that is caused by fire, as well as heavy rains in fall springs, where we get early springs and then it turns cold again. So in looking at those, they considered threats of 1 or 2 and determined that 97% of those species studied could be really affected by 1 or 2 of those threats if it goes to 3 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Under this 1.5 degree warming scenario, that number would be reduced to 20%. Or looking at it another way, they looked at the bird species that would face 3 or more climate threats, and there would be 305 at that 3 degree temperature level, whereas it would only be 34 bird species at 1.5 degrees. Show you a little more data. The report really classified birds as either highly vulnerable or moderately vulnerable or mildly vulnerable, and looked at that by habitat. So I just looked at some of the highly vulnerable species, and so many of these are really in the Arctic or the high latitude areas, which is where global warming is initially having its greatest impact. So we can see that all 16 of the Arctic species would be rated as highly vulnerable, almost that much for the boreal forest. The western forest, of course, would be the high elevation areas in the western part of the country. And water birds, the reason that's so high is that most of them actually breed at the higher latitudes. Mildly vulnerable, not as much, but certainly still a number of species, as much as 40 to 45% of those species in marshland and arid land are either high or moderate in terms of their assessed threat. So talk about one bird. I love it when I can see people and talk to people in person, because I really can't see anything right now. But I don't know how many of you have seen a wood thrush. I certainly hope that many of you have heard a wood thrush. It's got a beautiful flute-like song. And it's a bird that breeds across all of the eastern part of the United States and all of North Carolina. The 2 maps on the right are a little difficult to interpret. This is Florida down here. But what you need to pay attention to is just the red areas. And the red areas are the range loss that would be experienced either at 1.5 degrees centigrade warming or 3 degrees centigrade warming. And you can see the significant difference of what that is. And looking at it in North Carolina, if global warming goes to 3 degrees above pre-industrial levels, essentially wood thrushes will only be found in the mountains of western North Carolina and will be wiped out from the remainder of the state. Whereas if we can keep it to 1.5 degrees centigrade, they will certainly still be here in the western part of the state, but will be stable across more than half of their range in North Carolina. Another nice tool that's available through this new report, and I will say that it's really easy to get to the report. If you can just remember Audubon and survival by degrees, Google that, and it will take you to the opening page of the report. And you scroll down a little bit and you will find this tool. It's called the Birds and Climate Visualizer. And if you put your zip code in there, it will show you information and pictures about birds that are threatened in your area. So I did that yesterday for Highlands. I've forgotten the zip code already, but I used the correct one. And so it would actually show pictures of all these birds. You can select either winter or summer. I selected summer, and then you can select at 3 degrees centigrade, 2 degrees centigrade, or 1.5. So at 3 degrees centigrade in Highlands, there are 20 species that are in the high vulnerability category. Whereas if we kept it to 1.5 degrees centigrade, that would drop to 3. And I should mention that in this 20 includes the eastern towhee and the brown thrasher. And I don't know how many birders we've got here, but eastern towhees and brown thrashers are common residential birds that are probably found in your yard in Highlands. They certainly are found in my yard in Nashville. And it's just a little stunning to me that those two common residential birds would be that threatened. Now, the moderate vulnerability species only drops from 25 to 20, and of course the low and stable species would rise as if we keep the global warming down lower. So wildlife viewing is actually a huge economic driver in this state. Wildlife viewers spend about $1 billion annually in North Carolina. Most of that, I believe, is attributed to birds. I don't think there are many people that are visiting North Carolina to look for black bears. Of course, if they're driving down the parkway, they're always looking for black bears, but it's mostly for birds. Now, that $1 billion figure includes what they're spending on bird feeders and bird food and everything, but it's a major economic impact in North Carolina. And it's this whole climate threat is not just about birds. So this is a quote from Pope Francis, but vulnerable people around the world will be impacted. They're going to be impacted by drought, by flooding, by failing crops. In fact, in many places that's already occurring. It may lead to migration by affected people, and there's concerns that that will create a geopolitical challenge across the globe. So one of the critical outcomes of this report on birds is that it gives us a lens to view climate change. So birds are the lens, but climate change will affect all of us. So it's just not all about birds. And sorry I couldn't drive up there today, but my bumper sticker reads, "Protect birds and we protect the earth." So I've painted a pretty despairing picture up till now, and but there is hope. We all know how resilient nature is, and if you give birds and other wildlife a half a chance, they'll find a way to survive. I always said I'm a half glass full kind of guy, so I can't just be in despair. So the good news shows that if we can take that action and address climate change, that we can help improve chances for 3/4 of the birds that are threatened by this, as shown in this study. So if we can keep it to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, nearly 150 of those 300 something birds would no longer be vulnerable to extinction. So what is the solution? Well, I'm going to talk about a number of things that people can do and what we all need to do. We really already know what we need to do. We need to protect the places birds need now and in the future. And we really need to take personal action in addressing the root causes of climate change. I'm not going to go over these because I'm going to talk about each one of them, but those are Audubon's climate initiatives. And the first one really is to talk about it. And that's why I'm here today, and I'm delighted I was invited. But that's the first thing to do. Talk to your friends and neighbors and colleagues, and share information on social media. Everyone loves birds, so you can simply say that. Did you know that birds are threatened by climate change? So everybody's voice is important here. Protecting climate strongholds, of course, is a critical action to take. Audubon, North Carolina has identified geographic areas across the state which are critical strongholds for birds now, and will be even more important for birds in the future as global warming increases. So it's really important that we protect our existing preserves, but we also need to protect existing undeveloped areas that may be important to birds as they seek the required climate conditions. So again, I commend Highlands-Cashiers Conservation Trust, because that's exactly what they're doing. They're looking for areas that can be protected and preserved in some way. It's just a really critical thing to do. this is the first time I've given a presentation to a conservation trust, but I will tell you that in all my presentations, I always say, support your local conservation trust. It's an important thing to do. But really, the biggest thing that we can all do is to reduce our greenhouse gases. So it's a difficult challenge. Not all of us can buy a electric car or a hybrid car. Not everyone can put solar panels on their roof. We all can sit there and say that it's easy for each of us to think that the problem is just so overwhelming that you can't do anything, and that as an individual you can't do anything, that you can't make a difference. But you really can. You can certainly reduce your own energy use, but you can also support the efforts to use clean energy and renewable energy by reaching out to elected officials. I'll talk a little bit about battery storage, because that's kind of a new technology that's going to help us a great deal. Somehow supporting solar or wind has become a political bullseye that people on either end of the political spectrum seem to get at cross purposes about that. But battery storage is very politically safe. It's just a wonderful new technology that will help reduce pollution and allow us to increase our reliance on renewables. North Carolina, I don't know if I mentioned this already, but North Carolina is the second in the nation behind California in the amount of solar energy that we produce, and yet it still only covers about 4% of our state's energy needs. So being able to invest in battery storage is just a huge win. So Audubon and other groups have been working hard with elected officials. And so there is hope, and some of the recent wins give us hope. So two events, one in the state of Washington and one in New York, were very important. Washington's going to phase out coal from its electricity grid by 2015, and New York's clean energy standard will require that 50% of the state's electricity will be obtained from renewable sources by 2030. Well, you say Washington and New York, those are pretty progressive states. Well, we had two wins, one in South Carolina and one in Arkansas. And in both cases, the states passed bills that supported the expansion of solar energy, and just an incredible step forward for this, for two states that may not be seen as progressive. I will also mention that in Texas, there's a small town called Georgetown, population 67,000. And in 2017, it became the largest city in the United States to be powered entirely by renewable energy. And this is in Texas, the oil state. So it can happen anywhere. It's happening locally in cities and counties and regions across the country. It may not be happening at the federal level, but we hope that will change at some point. I know that our city and our county, Asheville and Buncombe County, where I live, both adopted resolutions to end greenhouse gas emissions for city and county operations. Obviously, that's not doesn't cover private sector and residential areas, but it's certainly a great step forward. And there's been announcements about the investment of funds into battery storage over the last 2 years. So we can expect to see some really increases in that technology. Another reason for hope for me is that in many ways, the younger generations are driving the climate movement. And I hope all of you will think about your grandchildren as you listen to what I'm saying. Last year in September, I attended a climate justice rally in Asheville. This is not a picture from that rally, but it could have been because there were so many young people there and so many banners up, and people had an opportunity to speak for 3 minutes. And I believe half of them were young people. I wish I'd gotten a picture of my favorite banner or a placard. It read, "There is no planet B." So think about that one. I'm sure you've all heard about Greta Thornburg, who's the young Swedish girl who's been a really effective advocate and who lectured, excuse me to some of you out there, but I'm one of them, lectured the old men at the United Nations saying, shame on you, you've stolen my future. So taking political action is a big step you can take, and there's hope there too. Our chapter last year developed a advocacy plan, first chapter in North Carolina to do so, and we are mobilizing our members and our supporters through what we call action alerts. The action alerts are emails that go out to everybody on our email list, and it will basically provide background information defining the problem, whether it's threats to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act or offshore drilling, or it may be good things that the General Assembly is promoting. And in addition to providing the background information, it'll provide the goal, kind of what are the actions that are needed, and it will provide some tips about what people can do, calling and writing their legislators or letters to the editor. And so we're working hard on our advocacy. And in fact, Audubon, North Carolina, in 2019 was our third consecutive year, what we call Advocacy Day. We called it Lobby Day initially. And we actually met in Raleigh and had individual meetings with legislators. In 2019, I think there were 60 some of us down there. I counted earlier today, there's at least 11 people in this picture from Western North Carolina. And we met with 40 or 50 individual legislators and sat down with them to encourage them to promote Audubon's initiatives. And one of the nice things about Audubon is that our membership really cross-cuts the political spectrum. So 40 to 45% of our members nationally and in North Carolina self-identify as either conservative or moderate. And no other conservation organization can say that. And what it means is that the legislators tend to listen to us. They know we cross-cut that political spectrum, and they know that we vote. This year, with the pandemic, it was a bit different. So we held virtual advocacy day using Zoom, just as we're doing now. And we actually had 93 Audubon members from across the state sign up to do that. And we had meetings with 70 some legislators and a few more for which they got called away to a meeting, and we filmed a message to them and sent it. So the advocacy is a way to go forward. Reaching out to your legislators, writing letters are things that we can all do. And then the final thing is creating bird-friendly communities. So for over 100 years, Audubon's been working or focusing on making the world a better place for birds. And really over the last 2 or 3 decades, we've started to focus on our work in cities and towns where people live, where birds and people live together. It's an important step on that. And here's the reason why. This is a housing density map of North Carolina, and the warmer colors are the yellows and oranges and reds. And this is 1990, and those warmer colors are the highest housing density. This is a 2030 map. So I'm going to go back and show you the 1990 map again. 1990 map, 2030 map. So we're seeing significant population growth and development. And that means that cities and towns, that parks and natural areas, that churches and school gardens and grounds and your yard are just that much more important for birds. When those migrating birds are flying all night, they're going to drop down to the first green place they see, and that really could be your yard. So what we're encouraging people to do is to plant native plants, and I'm going to talk about why they matter. But probably the single easiest action that an individual can take to help birds and to help birds in the face of climate change is to plant native plants in your yard. So why do native plants matter? Most of our birds, about 96% of our birds have to feed their babies insects. So even those birds that grow up to be fruit eaters, like cedar waxwings or Baltimore orioles, or grow up to be seed eaters, like the beautiful little yellow American goldfinches you see in your yard, or sparrows, they still have to feed their babies protein when they're young. The babies need that protein to grow their feathers and to grow their bones and to be able to fledge. And most of that comes from insects, or really all of it comes from insects, and most of it comes from caterpillars. So we're looking at a little Carolina chickadee. I'm sure most of you have these in your yard with a little black cap and the black throat. And that Carolina chickadee female will lay 5 eggs. And it takes about 14 to 16 days for those eggs to hatch. And for those after those eggs hatch, it takes about 14 to 16 days for those babies to grow their feathers and their bones and be able to fly away. And over that, and I usually ask the audience to guess how many caterpillars those 7 birds, 5 babies, 2 adults eat during those 16 days. And it's interesting to get the guesses. It's 9,000 caterpillars. I was stunned when I first read that information. I actually did the math and figured out that it was possible. And so where do they get these caterpillars? They get them from native plants. So on the left, you see an oak tree, and there are many species of oak tree in this country. And oak trees host 537 species of caterpillars. How do we know that? Graduate students. So support your local graduate students. The tree on the left is a beautiful exotic ginkgo tree from Asia. It supports 4 species of caterpillar. So why is that? Well, over eons, our insects and our plants have co-evolved, have evolved together. And when the insects lay their eggs on the leaf and the egg hatches and that little caterpillar comes out, it can deal with the leaf chemistry of that oak tree. It's not going to kill the insect, and the insect is going to eat some leaves and disfigure them, but it's not going to kill the tree. They've reached some equilibrium over all that time. Whereas the ginkgo tree on the right, our insects have not developed the ability to deal with the leaf chemistry of that plant, of those leaves. So if all you have is so if all you have is non-native plants and exotic plants in your yard, then basically it's a food desert for birds, or that ginkgo tree is a piece of furniture. So you can create a bird-friendly yard and a climate-friendly yard. Another thing that you can do that can bring us hope, eliminate some grass, plant native species. So I'm just about at the end here. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, there was a tradition on Christmas Day of what was called the side hunt. And the men, I don't know, maybe a few women, but I think it was mostly men, would go out and do this. I wonder if all those birds were eaten. I'm betting not by humans. Some of them may have gone to the pigs, but so one of our early leaders, a man named Frank Chapman, really helped change that by establishing the first Audubon Christmas bird count. And that count eventually kind of replaced the side hunt. And it's now the longest running citizen science project in the world. It's been going now on for 115 years. So Audubon made a difference there. And oops, lost one page that I need to look at there. Sorry, I will get back to it. So right after the turn of the century, birds were really faced with, a number of birds were faced with extinction from hunting for their plumes, put on hats. And, once again, Audubon came to the table, and over a period of about 10 years, working with Congress and working with other groups, stopped it by helping to pass the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So we've done it in the past, we can do it again, and I believe there's hope. Birds sing beautifully, but they cannot speak. So it really is up to us to be the voice of birds. I will leave this slide up here for just a minute, let you look at it and say that I'm happy to take questions at this point. And in just a second, I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll see if Ann has any questions for me.
So just a reminder to, if you have questions, to use the chat feature, which is the little talk button in the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I do have a question from Helen. Wants to know, is there an app that you like that can help us learn the bird songs or to identify the bird?
I am the email ambassador for our chapter. So every email that comes into our website, I get. I had that exact same question a couple of days ago. There are lots of bird apps out there that will help you identify birds visually, by seeing their field marks. And most of those apps will have the songs on there as well. I use the Sibley app, but there's a number of them, including an Audubon app that will play the bird songs. But what I tell people, learning bird songs is a real challenge. And what I mostly tell people is see and hear. If you can see that bird singing, it's the best learning possible. If you can see that bird watching singing, you're going to have a better chance of retaining that song in your head. And there are people that have better audio memory than others, people that have better ears. Lots of men lose their high frequency hearing as they get older, and I am not one of those because I never had high frequency hearing. I lost it long before I got old. So I wish I could tell you more than that. iBird is an app, Audubon app, the Merlin app from Cornell University, Sibley's app, all have the songs on there. But learning songs is perseverance and time. You have to go out there and see the birds and listen. And even good hearing birders almost have to relearn some songs every spring when they start singing again. So good luck.
Any other questions for Tom? Feel free to type them in, and happy to pose them.
Well, I really appreciate everybody coming today, and I hope you will take those actions you can take to help birds, because what helps birds helps people.
Well, Tom, thank you. We appreciate so much the information that you've presented today. It's very important, and I think all of us that live here, and as you pointed out, those who visit here very much love the birds that make Western North Carolina their home, and a lot of them make their home in the village green as well. And so we do try to, you've given us some practical tools and tips too to try and address some of the threats that they're facing, and we really appreciate that. I'll mention at this juncture that I will be sending a link. We have been recording this presentation, and so I will send a follow-up email to you with the link to the recording, so you have the opportunity to share this with others, with friends and acquaintances that you think might be interested. It will also be up on our YouTube channel for anyone to be able to download it on demand, and we'll be posting that via social media. Before we leave this evening, I want to promote our program for the month of August. August, as you know, we will be celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote. And so in the spirit of that centennial, we're going to have a woman naturalist, quite famous woman naturalist actually, Isla Hatter, also known as the Lady of the Forest. She was featured prominently in a book about women of the Smokies. And she's going to be coming and presenting our program in August, which will be Tuesday, August the 25th at 5 p.m. And it will also be via Zoom. Isla is a descendant of Pocahontas. And she is great with native plants, so that's a nice tie-in. We've had that kind of as a theme throughout. We had native pollinators and gardening for native pollinators earlier in the spring, but she is big about natural remedies. And so Isla's going to be coming, and she's going to be demonstrating how to make some remedies with locally foraged herbs. So I think that's a very timely program. You will want to make note of that and make sure you sign up for the Zoom link for that. But again, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you for supporting the Highlands-Cashiers Land Trust and the Village Green, who present this series of programs on natural and cultural features. As Gary and I like to regularly say, we believe that an educated constituency makes educated choices, and so we appreciate you taking the time to get educated so that we can care for the beautiful place that we live. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next month. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.